This is where the United States, Canada, and Mexico will play during the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Dímelo, mi gente, travel football fan here. I'm helping fans save money and travel the 2026 FIFA World Cup. So many of you have been asking, hey, is Mexico playing all of their games in Mexico? Where's the US playing? What about Canada? Well, let's go ahead, make a deep dive into the schedule, which we already know the places where these teams will play, not only in the group stage, but if they make it out in first or second place, we will know what their pathways all the way to the final New Jersey would be. All right, let's start with the United States. They have decided to start their World Cup on the West Coast, okay? So their first game is going to be at SoFi on June 12th. Then they're going to go to Seattle to play at Lumen Field and then come back to Los Angeles for their third match. Now, here's what the pathways diverge. If they finish in first place, they will go to San Francisco. So it keeps them in the West Coast. If they win that game, then they go to Seattle, still in the West Coast. If they win that game, they go to Los Angeles. Remember, there's a round of 32, round of 16, and quarterfinals, semis, final. Okay. So again, that was San Francisco for the round of 32, Seattle, round of 16, quarterfinals, back to LA. So they are staying all in the West Coast up until the semifinal. If they win that game in LA, then they go to Dallas, and then, of course, to Newark in the final, right? This is assuming the U.S. will make the run all the way to the final. Again, that sequence of cities is if the U.S. finishes in first place in their group. If the U.S. finishes in second place in their group, then their round of 32 match would happen in Dallas. Then they would go to Atlanta if they win that round of 32 match. Round of 16, Atlanta. If they win that game, they go to Kansas City for the quarterfinal. If they win that game, they come back to Atlanta for the semifinal. So, what this pathway is showing is that the U.S. has prioritized the West Coast for sure, right? And basically, it is to their best interest to finish in first place in their group because that would indeed limit their travel. The other unique part of this pathway for the United States is that they are not playing the July 4th Independence Day match in Philadelphia. The only real way that could happen is if the US finishes as one of the best third place teams, and it really depends on which third place spot they get. So it would have to be almost like an act of God type of situation for the United States to be able to play a July 4th match in Philadelphia. But then, of course, by that point, you're adding more travel for the team, and their fans, right? And that just makes it even more unlikely that the U.S. would even reach that game, which I believe is around a 16 match, if I'm not mistaken, in Philadelphia, July 4th. So the U.S. prioritizing the West Coast. They're not playing a July 4th match in Philadelphia, Independence Day. Those vibes are sad ego noises, not going to happen. All right, for Team Canada, okay, they're going to start their World Cup in Toronto. Then they're going West Coast to Vancouver for game 2 and game 3. If they finish in first place in their group, they go and stay in Vancouver for the round of 32. If they win that game, they stay in Vancouver and play the round of 16 there. So Vancouver could be host to 4 Canada's home matches. Pretty amazing deal there for Vancouver. If Canada wins that round of 16 match in Vancouver, then they go to Kansas City. They win that game, they go to Atlanta for the semifinal, and then, of course, the final in Newark. Here's where it gets a little bit interesting when we get to Mexico. So pay attention to this. If Canada finishes in second, they go to Los Angeles. Remember that one when we talk about Mexico in a minute. If they win that game, okay, they go to Houston. If they win that game, they go to Boston. If they win that game, they go to Dallas for the semifinal. And of course, Newark is the final. So, a bit of a snob, I would say, for Toronto, considering that Canada could have easily played game 1 and game 2 in Toronto and then played game 3 Vancouver. And then maybe they still finish first in the group and then would have played a round of 32 in Vancouver. So at least evening out the games for Team Canada between Toronto and Vancouver. But clearly, this is a choice by Canada Soccer to say, no, we want our team. Sure, initial game, the first game they start in Toronto, fine, that makes sense. But we want the home crowd advantage and we want the size. BC Place is a bigger stadium than BMO Field. And so that's why they clearly have said 4 straight games in Vancouver. Again, if Canada finishes in first and wins their round of 32 game, that really sets them up for a quarterfinal matchup in Kansas City. So in terms of travel, if you compare that to the United States, this is a better deal for Team Canada compared to the USA. Much, much better deal. Now we're going to see Mexico. And I remember what I told you. Remember that second place finish for Canada, because it's going to apply for Mexico as well. All right, now para Mexico, okay? Obviamente, you're starting the entire tournament. We're starting at Azteca, okay? Game 2 will be in Guadalajara. Game 3 will be back at Estadio Azteca. If you finish first place in the group, you stay in La Ciudad de Mexico and you play your round of 32 match at Azteca. If you win that game, you stay in Mexico City. You play another game at Azteca. So kind of like Canada, Mexico City gets 4 games del Tri. Again, better in terms of travel than the U.S. Just saying. If you win that game, that round of 16 match in Azteca, you go to Miami. Funny enough. And you play the quarterfinals in Miami. If you win that game, then you go to Atlanta for the semifinal and then Newark. Okay. Seems like a pretty straightforward path. If you finish second in your group, Mexico, póngale ojo, you go to LA. Wait a minute. So it's potentially a Mexico versus Canada matchup in LA. Pues in terms of the crowds, you're going to say, well, no, pues eso es partido de casa para Mexico, right? Like, y'all will come out at SoFi, I'm sure. But that is very interesting that is happening for Mexico and Canada, but not for the U.S. That was kind of odd to me. Remember, Mexico's Group A, Canada's Group B, USA's Group D. Very, very odd to say the least. But let's just say, Mexico, you beat Canada. If Canada finishes second as well, you win that LA game, then you follow the same path as Canada. You would go to Houston for the round of 16. If you win that game, you go to Boston for the quarterfinal. There is where I start saying, okay, it's much better for Mexico to finish first in their group, because then you get to stay in La Ciudad de Mexico, and then you take a shorter flight to Miami, where there is a lot of Mexicans también in Florida, instead of then having to do this pathway of LA, Houston, and then Boston. Like, you're going throughout the entire continent. And then, of course, the semifinal, Dallas. So again, if you finish second, LA, Houston, Boston, Dallas, and then, of course, Newark, the final. All right, mi gente, that was a review of the pathways for Mexico, Canada, y los Estados Unidos to go all the way to the final in Newark for the 2026 World Cup. Honestly, if you ask me who has the easier of the pathways just purely on travel, it's Canada and Mexico. And this is where they are extremely incentivized to finish in first place in their groups, because if one of them finishes second, they're guaranteed a longer travel path. Okay, so Mexico and Canada need to finish in first, so in that way they can get as many home games as possible. Okay, in the case of both teams, they would get 5 home games, and that would hopefully catapult them into the quarterfinals. For the United States, I get it. You are at home regardless. LA, Seattle, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, LA. Of course, you're like the most home team, right, of all of these. But to me, it's weird that they are still having to travel more often than either Mexico or Canada, right? So it might be because they're trying to get different audiences along the West Coast. That's totally a possibility. But if I was the U.S. Soccer Federation, I would have had them either replace either the San Francisco game with L.A. or with the Seattle game with L.A. and just keep the team much more consistently in the same spot than what they have right now in terms of their pathway. Okay. I I also am a bit surprised that they did pick the West Coast, as their base of operations. I mean, were they not really feeling the July 4th game? That's very interesting, considering that the United States is also celebrating its 250th birthday. I was really surprised they didn't really set themselves up to a more Northeast path. You had Boston, obviously New York, Philadelphia. It would have connected well with the 250th anniversary. Maybe not so much now with the political turbulence that the United States is facing, perhaps. But even then, I'm very surprised that the U.S. Soccer Federation did not go with a Northwest path and instead wholly focusing on the West in that respect. Okay. But really, other than that, no real major surprises here in terms of the pathways. They make a lot of sense. Okay. And now that you know where these teams are playing, again, whether they finish first or second, this allows you some ability to think ahead, be like, okay, cool. So if I'm going to stay in Mexico, right? That's at least, if we look at the schedule, 2 weeks that you're staying in Mexico, right? If you're for Team Canada, 2 weeks in Vancouver. Those hotels in Vancouver are going to be very expensive. For 2 weeks, very expensive. So Team Canada, right? If you're a Canada men's soccer team supporter and you don't live in Vancouver, it's going to be expensive for you to stay in Vancouver. Okay. For the Mexicano fans, like I said, even staying 2 weeks in Mexico, pues tienes que ahorrarte su buen dinero. You're going to have to save a lot of money. Tienes que tener un ahorro bien grande para poder estar ahí las 2 semanas en la Ciudad de México. ¿No? Para ver, ¿qué? ¿Serían 5 partidos de casa para México? Bueno, that's still going to cost you a lot of money, right? Even with familia, even with some additional advantages of having family there. So that's going to be interesting to see. For the U.S., for sure, it is going to be an expensive World Cup as a U.S. soccer supporter because you're having to bounce around. Again, L.A., Seattle, L.A., San Francisco, Seattle, L.A., or the first 3 games then Dallas, Atlanta, KC. Like you're bouncing around a lot. So you're also hoping, if you're a U.S. men's soccer team fan, that your team also finishes in first place because then you can maybe say San Francisco's your home base. At least it's in between LA and Seattle. But even then, San Francisco is also going to be expensive. San Francisco also, that's at least a couple hour flights to LA and back, and then a couple hours flight to and from Seattle. So it's not going to be cheap following the U.S. It's going to be, honestly, I don't even know which team is cheaper to follow. Vancouver, you're going to face the issue of the hotels being super expensive. Ciudad de México, that might be the cheapest, pero también van a estar todos ahí. Everyone wants to go to those games in la Ciudad de México, so that might also still be expensive. But I would say the U.S. fans following Team USA, that is definitely going to be the most expensive of the 3 home teams to follow. All right, mi gente, let's conclude the video there. Thank you so much for your support. Remember to subscribe and click on the bell button so in that way you are notified when I produce these videos. I'm going to be going on a blitz. I'm going to try to make a YouTube video at least once a day for the next couple of weeks to get us to those monetization goals, but also, to share a little bit of the behind the scenes. My last day with full employment will be this Friday. January 31st. And so I'll just be depending on my coaching salary, which isn't much. And so that's why I need to get YouTube pushed and monetized as fast as possible. Because with TikTok, it's on live support right now. It is generating some funds, but we need more monetization streams. I'm also working on a newsletter, which will be free to all my followers. I'm going to try to, monetize that through other ways and not charge you. So really, I'm just trying to make a big push here. So again, thank you so much for your support. Please share this video out to your friends and family as well. We all need to know, okay? There ain't no point trying to gatekeep this information. The more knowledge we all have, the better decisions we will be able to make in terms of our money, in terms of our travel, and overall, just be able to enjoy this World Cup as much as possible. Ahí nos vemos, mi gente. En la próxima.